Welcome to The Whole View. I'm Stacy Toth of Real Everything, and I'm here each week to dive deeper into how we can find happiness and health inside and out through self-love, body positivity, and discovering new ways to be our best selves. Before we get started, a reminder, this podcast is for general educational purposes and is not intended to diagnose, advise, or treat any physical or mental illness. We always recommend that you see a licensed health professional accordingly. That said, we do have Dr. Alisa here and her brother, Ian Karmel. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yes, excellent.
Thank you.
Ian and Alisa are siblings and co-authors of the upcoming memoir titled T-Shirt Swim Club, Stories from Being Fat in a World of Thin People, which is available for you on June 11th. Ian is an Emmy award-winning writer, stand-up comedian, podcaster, and the head writer for The Late Show with James Gordon. And Alisa is a doctor of psychology and holds master's degrees in nutrition and psychology. Both brother and sister struggled with their weight throughout their childhood and much of their adulthood, unpacking the ways weight has affected both siblings, the dieting, dating, fat jokes, all of the things is documented in the book, and how they were treated and the impact that had on their relationship with food and their bodies. I am excited to have a conversation with you both. Welcome to the show. Maybe you can introduce Alisa, and then Alisa, you can introduce Ian and tell us something personal about the other that's top secret. Nobody would know except the sibling. Air out their dirty laundry just to get to know you a little more.
Definitely. I think this is the place to rat out on each other. So when our parents listen, they'll find out things, right? My little sister, Dr. Alisa Karmel, is earnestly one of the smartest people I've ever met in my entire life. And the entire reason, I think, well, not the entire reason, but I think the main driving factor in why this book, I think, will be, useful and helpful more than just funny. But putting that aside for a second, she is, what's a good description? An amazing high school rugby player.
Yeah.
a, a driven student, an incredibly compassionate person, and I think a person driven by compassion and life experiences to want to help other people. A new mother. Finished writing this book with a newborn in the house, which is insane. Yeah, I don't know. And just a wonderful, delightful person. And the degrees, a doctor of psychology, master's degrees all over the place, dog owner, frequent walk enthusiast, busy person in our family group thread where we check in on each other all the time.
I love that you put multiple master's degree in the same sentence as dog owner, because I would agree, like they're equally as difficult.
I've never owned a dog, but from the outside, they look like equal amounts of work and responsibility.
And Alisa, I do hope that you poke some fun at Ian here.
Oh, it's so hard to, though. Thanks, Ian. That's a nice way to start the day, by the way.
It is early out here, too. This is the earliest I've been up in forever.
Oh, parenthood. I'm usually up at this time. Gosh, how do I follow that? I would say I would follow that with Ian we come from the same blood. So I would say that so many things are true for Ian, but I would say the leading factor is the size of his heart and how it just impacts everybody he walks to. He's well known because he's funny, but once you get to know him, it's like he's your best friend. He stands up for what needs to be stood up for, even if it's not the popular opinion. Like, he's always got your back. And obviously I'm biased because I'm his sister, but we didn't have the best relationship for the first part of our lives. I know he wanted to protect me, but he hated my guts for quite some time. So, but then he started loving me.
I never hated you. We were born 4 years apart. I'm 4 years older. So it was
That's true. But
just when you're not the baby anymore, another baby comes along and you're like, but I'm the baby. So I think it was that.
But he's forever the baby. He is the favorite. And if he ever did anything, I'd go, and like scream at the top of my lungs and get him in trouble. But Ian, he makes the best food in the world. And this is I feel like a recent talent that he's been fairly recent that he's been exploring, but he is probably the best chef in the kitchen. My dad would like destroy me if he heard me say that. Mom's a great cook, but Ian wins.
Which is good to have something to fall back on now that the entertainment industry is collapsing.
And he's a kitty person. So he has 2 kitties. Loves his kitties. His kitties love basketball. And they're the fluffiest cuties ever. They are mentioned in the book. So look for them. little mentions. We did grow up with cats, so cats are just like in our, we just love him. He's an awful Prius driver. I'll say that. There's my crap talking. I think he's an insane LA Prius driver with like the bumper on his car, little scratched up.
Yeah, I drive it like it's a Mad Max mobile. The bumper is falling off the back of my Prius.
But it
It's
works.
it does work. In a city with 10,000 Priuses in every parking lot, I can usually find my Prius.
And unlike most
Scratched up one without a
Americans,
back bunker.
he doesn't have a car payment, which, hey, and he has no student debt, unlike me.
Well, I think one of the interesting things you do have in common is this struggle that you both talked about in terms of growing up and feeling what is essentially fat shamed as children, both internal and external factors. And it's unusual to hear from siblings, especially male and female siblings, going through this journey through diet culture, disordered eating, body dysmorphia, like all the things. I'd love to hear more about how you both came together with this idea as adults to share the story.
Yeah, I think we were. Alisa was just someone I would talk to about lots of issues in my life. Oftentimes, like dating and romantic, like those kind of things. When things would be going wrong with a relationship, I would reach out to Alisa, and we just had talked about so many different issues that we we both got to a point, which I think we'll get into more later. But we had both. I really needed to get to a healthier weight, and when I say healthier, like healthier, because the way I was living was affecting my quality of life and what would have been the length of my life in a very real way. And I got to the point where I had gotten to a healthier weight, and Lisa had done the same thing. We were talking just about our journey to that point through our childhood, being fat kids, being fat adults. And like Elisa said earlier, never really talking about those experiences before, even though we were going through them on parallel tracks. It had never been anything we discussed because you don't want to, you struggle so much to not be defined by that when you feel it defining almost every part of your life, the way it so often does, the way that society and culture and other people will strive to define you through your fat. We never really wanted to talk about that with each other. And then we got to this other side of it a bit, or I guess stepped outside of the hurricane of it. And we're talking about it to each other. And I'm like, wow, we have two really interesting perspectives on this. I dealt with being a fat kid by becoming a stand-up comedian. I think Aliza was motivated in part to become a doctor in clinical psychology by her experiences with it and working in nutrition and all this stuff. And we started talking about it. And we were like, if we should see if we have something to say here and bat some ideas around. And it turned out that we did. Is that accurate, Aliza?
Love it. Yeah. Wouldn't have
So
anything.
I want to start off with what will be a little bit of a challenge. And I think that this is part of the conversation that's important about your book and everything in cultural conversation, which is that I heard you say two things. I heard you say, I needed to get to a healthier weight. And then you corrected yourself and said, I needed to be healthier. I needed to have healthier habits. And for me, those are two very different things. As someone who has had eating disorders and disordered eating my whole life,
Mhm.
sometimes when I was at my thinnest, I was actually at parts of my least healthiest. And so I try to have a very safe space for listeners here who are on that same journey. And I, one, want to ask that we be careful when we use phrases that we're using technically accurate phrases, which is like, it's great that you realized you wanted to have healthier habits. And if that led to weight loss or not, I think is where I want to like put that on the side because I do think that it's really possible to be healthy regardless of what your body looks like. But I think that's also part of the cultural shift that needs to happen, right? Like based on the original BMI decision that was made that weight is tied to health, even though the World Health Organization said this is inaccurate. And we've seen that it be continuously inaccurate since it came out. And Alisa, I know that you have roots both in nutrition and on the emotional psychology side. So I'm assuming that this is not foreign for you either, that you're probably dealing with a lot of people who have struggles along this path. I'm wondering if we can maybe just before we jump into anything else, have a little bit of that discussion because I think it's impossible to talk about fatness, in my opinion, without also talking about the implication that one must not be fat in order to be
Huh.
healthy.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a huge point that I try to drive home throughout the book is that healthy does not equal not fat. That is like my biggest that's where the most work is done because so many folks that I work with come in thinking that they have to be skinny or not fat to equal health. And they might be the same, but mostly I always try to work on let's see what the health behaviors are that you value and see if we can increase those and improve the way you feel and the way that you think and the way that you act. Don't worry about the weight. Like it'll figure itself out if it needs to. And I think that's what happened for me was like a big aha moment in my own journey of changing my health because I was so attached to my weight for most of my life. Like I thought that if I was a certain weight, I would be happy. If I was a certain weight, I would find the right relationship. And I had all these beliefs that were just hammered and hammered into my brain. And then I just had like this explosion of like, none of that is true. It doesn't matter. And I saw that over and over again. People will come in after weight loss surgeries and be like, I'm depressed. What's going on here? I'm like, well, have you talked about why you're hurting? Have you explored your eating? Have you explored your hunger? And oftentimes that was missed. And to me, that's the more important part. It doesn't matter what your size is. It doesn't matter what your weight is. And that's what my voice is throughout the book is it would be great if you can find a space that is healthy in all the domains of your life. And that's my goal.
Ian, hopefully you can take a little poking of my rattling of what you said, but based on your book and everything, I think that you're in lockstep. It's so ingrained in us, right?
I can take all sorts of poking. I absolutely needed to. I weighed 420 pounds and I was at a place where I medically needed to get smaller and live healthier. So I can absolutely take poking, but I was at a point where like my blood pressure was so out of control. And part of that was due to I don't know. I guess this is a good discussion to have. And maybe hopefully this is a good place to have that discussion. And two, I couldn't think of two better people to have that discussion with. I am 100% with you, but I was also at a point where I did need to get a little bit to I needed to get to a healthier weight. And I got to that through healthier habits. I got to that through exercising more regularly, eating healthier, and I think better portions. I don't really see. Well, I don't know. I guess you can tell me why is it important to separate one from the other because they felt inextricable to me. Even if the healthy habits maybe would have not led me to a smaller number on the scale, which would be totally fine. The number I was worried about was my blood pressure.
So I am curious how Alisa would answer this question. My response to you would be if your concern was your blood pressure, then what are the lifestyle changes that you can make to address your blood pressure? And what I heard Alisa say is something might happen to your weight, something might not happen to your weight, but there are a ton of people who are in thin bodies that have blood pressure problems. And so, like, tying the two together and saying I needed to lose weight versus I was concerned about my health and wanting to improve metrics of health are two very different things for me.
Sure. But my blood pressure, which can be tied to any number of things from sodium intake or to alcohol intake or genetic makeup in a smaller person, my high blood pressure was tied not just to diet, but also to the size I was at. So for me, it was important for me to not have a stroke or a heart attack. To me, that was directly tied to how how like big. I guess there's not a great like clean way to say it. For me, it was tied directly to how big I had gotten. And it's hard to keep like hanging on it, but I had spent so long with my head stuck in the sand about that fact that I understand that there are all these other mitigating factors, but to me, that doesn't mean that I can necessarily separate those two things that did have a relationship with one another.
It's sometimes hard to know. Yeah, I think for Ian, he had a lot of different health metrics that he was following. I know that his blood pressure was something that was incredibly scary for him, and he had a fantastic cardiologist that he was working with to help him feel like he could have a healthier heart life. And I know that knowing his body fat percentage was also partnered in that. So I think he had several metrics that were going on. He also had a lot of anxiety, and it was anxiety not only tied to just operating, but also his health. And a lot of folks have health anxiety when they do have their head in the sand because they don't want to face what they're ignoring. They want to continue avoid, throw caution to the wind, and just keep moving forward. And I think one of the things that Ian did is that, as he just said, he finally addressed it. He finally looked at his health and said, what are the changes that I can make to be happy, to be healthy, and to live past 38, 39, 40, and onward? He made changes that I had never seen him do before, that I had never seen him cared about before. And that did include things that he mentioned, but it also included things like, when I'm stressed, maybe I should do some meditating. Maybe I should do breathing. Maybe I should go explore my garden. Maybe I need to sit with myself. Maybe I need to fight with my sister because something really blew me off and I'm pissed right now. And I think that learning to navigate the way that the world hits you is a really important part for everybody's health. And by that, stress is sneaky. Stress comes in so many different ways. And I think for my brother for so long, he just kept pushing it down, just dealing, taking the hits and dealing. And then finally he was like, okay, it's time to address this. And I think that's what he did. It was a whole body, holistic, complete reset of how he was finally taking care of himself. Whereas I think before this journey, he really did his best to ignore himself. And he speaks about that in the book.
So for me, all of that makes a lot of sense. As someone who has been on a ultimately yo-yo diet life for
Yeah.
hundreds of pounds up and down my whole life, I find it not just personally triggering, but I also know what it feels like to be like on the other side, to not just hear someone say, I needed to lose weight, but also for that implication to inherently be, you need to lose weight, right?
Mm.
To like have conversation with people about that. And so where I am pushing back a little bit on that sentence is just the understanding that culturally, my approach is to never talk about anybody else's body because you don't know what's going on with them. Someone might be losing weight because they're undergoing chemo treatment and you've just complimented their weight loss, and that can be a horrifying thing to do. Or someone could literally be losing weight because they have atypical anorexia and they're not eating, and then you're complimenting their eating disorder, right? Like there's a bunch of different things that if I were to describe your journey, Ian, it would be more like you had a realization that you weren't living a life that felt good to you, that you were living in fear about your body and different kinds of things, and that you took actions and steps to help yourself feel better in terms of both physical and mental health.
Mm.
And none of that would have been defined by the percentage of fat on your body or anything like that, because I do think that people can live full lives and genetically be predisposed to living in a larger body. And if they're having healthier lifestyles, like the research indicates that people who are overweight actually have the longest all-cause mortality lifespan, because we need a little bit of fat when we're older to get us through pneumonia or different kinds of things. If we fall and break a hip, but we have a little bit of padding, right? Like there's research that shows that obviously being in a place where you don't feel like you can breathe or you have heart problems or different kinds of things is entirely separate from, I think, the cultural discourse around the belief and judgment in people's bodies, which is disparate from what the research and science shows us is actually healthy. That's all.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. I think that's a place where we can agree, like, again, 100%. Like, I think Lisa and I have talked about body neutrality, like, get to that point in our book where I think that's very important to not comment on someone else's body or make assumptions about their health. That was always a really bizarre thing when I did start living healthier and lost. I'm still a fat person. I'm still proudly a fat person. I describe myself as fat. I use the word fat. I think we don't shy away from that word in our book because I don't think it's the word fat's fault that people are so, it's not the word's fault. It's the people who use it as a cudgel. And then that one soaks up all the pain and then they move on to a new word and then they beat you with that word instead. So that was a very bizarre thing in that process where like everyone's saying like, oh my God, you look so good. You look so good. You look so good. And it's impossible to avoid the sort of, I think we've all been through it, avoid the good feelings associated with people saying that and those little endorphin hits that you get. And then you realize that you're fueling your self-esteem off of the same system that people used to devalue you and debase you for the longest time. And you're still participating in this horrible cycle. So I think the more people can divorce themselves from that, the better. I don't mean in any way to speak generally about bodies. I speak only about mine when it comes to that. And I know it's hard for people to separate those two things. It's hard for me to separate those two things. Anytime I heard someone else talk about like losing weight and feeling better, I would feel it. Like, I'm like, well, you're speaking specific. It's one of the great storytelling things is to be specific makes it feel more general to everyone. The more specific you get, the more relatable it is for people who haven't been through anything you've been through. But I guess so I agree with you totally there. Although I also am very glad, whatever it took, that it sort of made me start living healthier to where you said I got to a place where it didn't feel good the way I was living anymore, which is 100% true. I am very glad that I was able to pull my head out of the sand because man, it was getting bad there for a while. Just I was living such an unhealthy life.
Well, I think listeners can probably hear you have a very comedic approach in how all of this is addressed both in the book and in your life. And one of the things that kind of stuck out to me as I was thinking about preparing for the show and the book and all the things is just that in Hollywood, especially, but also in our regular day to day lives, that people often lean into funny. And I find that if we don't, especially when we're younger and developing our personalities and our social groups, we could potentially lean into the opposite, right? We could be made fun of if we're not the ones making the jokes. And I know Rebel Wilson recently came out with her memoir where she talks about how self mockery was part of becoming famous, right? That like you have to make fun of yourself. That, as she says, when bigger body characters aren't typecast as funny, they're frequently pushed into the other extreme. And basically, no one apart from her mother wanted her to lose weight because they were all making money off of the fact that she was being funny in this larger body. And being that you are in comedy and have gone through this experience, I'd love to hear your perception and experiences along that journey.
Yeah. It would be wonderful if you making fun of your own weight stopped other people from doing it too. You, it's just, it's like from an early age, you learn that you're like, well, okay, if I guess I can get in on this too. This new upstart like company, this startup making fun of fat people. I'm like, okay, even though I'm fat, I'm not just a member, I'm the president. It was like that kind of thing for me growing up. So it started at a very early age to gain the cachet. And then when we were growing up, Alisa and I, it was everywhere. Fat jokes. They were in every aspect of popular culture was hinging on fat jokes. You would go to the movies, you would sit down for the second Austin Powers and Fat Bastard would appear on the screen. You'd go home and watch TV and it would be Eric Cartman. Or I loved this show called Salute Your Shorts. They had a character who looked just like me. His name was Donkey Lips. They made fat jokes about him all the time. And this was for guys. It's for women, I think it's even worse. There's
Hal.
Shallow
There-
Hal. Oh my
yeah.
God, that was horrible. Even at the time, it seemed like, what are we doing here? Even when it came out, that seemed like a horrendous thing, and everyone was just like cracking up at it. And wasn't like Jack Black in that as well? Was that the lead?
Yeah, he was the romantic ideal partner.
So often the call is coming from inside the house, right? He's one of us. He's like he's a fellow fat person. It was really damaging. And almost the worst part about it was really funny. Like, cause you had the world's most powerful comedic minds dedicating themselves. You had Mike Myers doing fat jokes, right? You had Trey Parker and Matt Stone. You had Eddie Murphy putting on a fat suit in multiple movies. So you have these undeniably funny people in an era where memes came from like movies and TV shows. So if something was funny, it would be repeated ad nauseum by like the people at your school.
Mm.
Flash forward 20 years to when I was in the entertainment industry after doing a lot of stand up comedy and making fun of myself and doing fat jokes and hoping I was elevating them and trying to like put it on its ear and sneak some humanity in there and everything. Sometimes successfully. I think sometimes not successfully. When you're bombing in front of a crowd in like Kansas City, Kansas, and the guy before you went up there and just did like white people are like this, black people are like this jokes for half an hour and killed, and then you're up there trying to do nuanced jokes about like self-esteem and body image, and you're just bombing. You're like, all right, I'm just going to feed these dopes fat jokes for an hour and then get off the stage out of a sense of self-preservation, which is how you start making fat jokes as a kid, is out of a sense of self-preservation. Like I said, flash forward 20 years, I'm in the entertainment industry, hoping it's better, thinking it must be better than it was 20 years ago, and finding that, like Rebel Wilson so astutely said, if you're not the joke, you're pathetic. If you're not Eric Cartman or Fat Bastard, you're the whale, right? Or you're like one of these TLC schmaltz washed sort of my 600-pound life. Oh my God, we're like disguising it in the guise of a documentary. What is it like to be this person? But it's all there for people to like gawk and be like, oh, there, but for the grace of God go I, right? Like that's still how the entertainment industry, I think, like they still don't really know how to portray people who are fat. They just don't know how to do it. I auditioned for it, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, but so forgive me for repeating myself, but I you get auditions, and I was writing on the Late Show, and I'm like, I still want to be on camera. I still want to be on camera, and I got an audition for this show, I'm Dying Up Here, which was about stand-up comedy in the 1970s, and I auditioned for this character called Tubbs the Obese Comedian, and I'm like, okay, well, if they're calling this character Tubbs the Obese Comedian, they must be like doing satire, right? Because that's insane. If you're calling the character Tubbs, you don't need to call him the obese comedian. You can call him Eric the obese comedian, or you could call him Tubbs the comedian. We get it. We get what you're saying, person who wrote this script. And I went in, and I was already disgusted by it, but you're like, all right, I'm going to go audition for it. I wish I had scruples that were good enough to say, like, I'm not doing it. I'm not taking that. I'm waiting for firefighter number 3, right? But no, there was none of that. I went in an audition and I gave them the most like cartoonish fat guy character read I could think of. Just everything I had had force fed to me as a kid from popular culture, I gave back to them. And I think I'm thinking like either I get this role and it's satire and that's what they want. They're looking for this cartoonish thing, or I hope they choke on it, basically. You know what I mean? Here's what you think you want. Here you go. And I got the role and I went and filmed it. And it turned out not to be satire at all. They just wanted like a lazy, fat, horrible archetype character. And I gave it to him. I played it. And I saw it and I was like, oh, okay. Cause you don't really know when you're filming a thing. You're not like, I don't know how this is going to show up on film. Maybe because they're filming me and then they're filming these other characters 30 yards away standing at the bar watching me. And you only see your section of the script. And it was nothing advanced. It was nothing that put it on its ear, nothing like that. And it hurt. It felt terrible because I was participating again in this system that I felt like it really harmed me as a kid. And what's even worse about it is I went back and played that character again like 2 years later in season 3, just because again, I was so desperate for the acceptance of being on television. So it's the entertainment industry, while I do think better, I honestly do think better than it was in the 90s, is still a place where you can find yourself playing on really old, really harmful stereotypes of fat people and being rewarded for it left and right.
I think that's such a poignant point, and thank you for your vulnerability and sharing how you felt after seeing that later. I think that what's happening culturally is the system is getting more savvy in how it hides and portrays these things. Have
Yes.
either of you seen or heard the show Reindeer on Netflix? It's like top 10 right now.
Yeah.
So Alisa's shaking her head no, but it's about it's okay. It's about a character who is based on a true story about a character who is stalked by someone who's obsessive. And the real life photo of the person is not nearly as extreme as the casting for the character, who is, if anybody has seen Death Becomes Her, it's like Goldie Hawn before she drinks the magic serum to make
Yeah.
her thin and lovely and beautiful, right? She is living in this like hovel hoarder type environment. She's eating a microwave meal the way that Goldie Hawn was eating cat food out of a can, and she is not just in a larger body, but she's not taking care of herself. And I think the difference here is that it's not Shallow Hal, it's not Goldie Hawn, it's not all these other things that you mentioned, but it is still leaning into how do I create a character that someone viscerally is grossed out by? I am immediately going to make them an overweight character and then lean into the idea that just because someone's overweight means that they don't take care of themselves. And so for me, I hear what you're saying about it has changed and gotten better in the 90s, but culturally,
Mhm.
that show is like top 10 on Netflix. And when I mentioned to one of my teenagers is struggling with, I have 4 teens, and one of them has had a very traumatic upbringing. They were a foster child that we're adopting, and they're really struggling with disordered eating right now. And they told me that they wanted to watch that show with me. And I said, I actually watched the first episode, and I don't think that it's a good idea for us to watch that show because, and I described that the extremes that the narration that they were trying to tell through the character's image. And my teenager was immediately like, ew, gross. I don't want to watch that. But clearly, that's not inherent to people who are watching the show because it made Netflix top 10, right?
Yeah.
Right. For sure. It's still, at least you can speak to this, I think, too, but it's still a shorthand, right? It's still, that's what in writing, in pitching shows and all that stuff, you learn very quickly. It's like, saying this with a mustache, but it's like stepdad with a mustache, creepy guy, right? So you pitch that, you're in a room pitching to an executives, and it's like, so there's a stepdad. You know what he's like. He's a creepy guy. He's got a mustache. And they're like, got it, locked in my head. And you're like, so the stalker, they're disgusting. They're lazy. They're fat. They're the fat person living in a basement, right? And this executive's like, got it, right? There's still these like terrible shorthands that exist out there. So yeah, you are right. It's gotten savvier. The system is learning.
Oh, it's just interesting because I've just noticed from a perspective of trying, at least how I feel it's perceived, is that the industry is trying to include some sort of larger bodied individuals at some capacity and just watching them, in my opinion, fail at that attempt to do it in a way that makes me feel included when I'm watching anything. And I just notice having reactions left and right. And I think when I was younger, I never saw anybody that I related to, and I think today I still don't. Like, it's just a continued issue in just a different way.
That's a really
It's
powerful point. I think that there have been a few characters that feel to me like that is a powerful person who is owning their truth, comfortable in their skin, not being made fun of. It's not a part of the plot line. It's just there existing, but it is very few and far between for sure. Yeah.
There's this great comedian and writer. His name's Guy Branum, and he's a big fat guy too. We've talked about this. I think he'd be comfortable with me saying that. And he speaks so intelligently about the way Hollywood handles fat people. And when The Whale came out, and Brendan Fraser, who put on a fat suit for that role and went out to, and won an Oscar for it and everything. And there was some clamor over like, why not let an actual fat actor play that role, that actor Beatty role, and that Oscar Beatty role. And I think there's some truth to that. That would have been wonderful too. At the same time, Brendan Fraser is definitely someone who's dealt with body issues and understands maybe some of that pain. And one thing Guy Branum said that I think really resonated with me is it's less the fact that fat people are losing out on roles to non-fat people who throw on suit, from like Sarah Paulson to Brendan Fraser to all sorts of people who like will throw on a fat suit and then go play a role. It's that there aren't these roles that aren't inherent, that like aren't defined by their fatness, that fat people don't get to play. That's what it is. It's that, like, if you just have inspiring school teacher, unless it's based
Mhm.
on a real person who is in the media, they're not going to let a fat person play that. And even then, they might not let a fat person play that. You might have like a fat teacher who inspired a bunch of kids, and then they're just like, well, that's not going to sell. So let's put in this slender person to play that role instead. It's the access to this entire other part of the industry that they just don't let you into. I know that from personal experience. There was not a single audition that I was offered, not a single one. The entire time when I was trying to be on camera, and I've been in Hollywood for like 11 years. I mostly write now, but for the first like 8 years of that, I was regularly auditioning. And I don't think there was a single part that where the fat or like or whatever word they want to chuck in there, jolly, chubby, the best friend, whatever like little like term they wanted to use to again hide it into the system, as you so astutely put it. There wasn't a role that I was offered or even offered to audition for that didn't include that in some way. And that's the real, I like, that's not the real one, but that's another one of the poisons of it all.
Alisa, I'm wondering, as someone who is focused in psychology, where a lot of these questions come up for me as we talk about this is not just the subliminal messages that's being shared to children who aren't seeing someone like themselves as capable, successful, attractive, right? All these things that we have to, in our adulthood, overcome and determine and find our own truth, but also in how it shapes our own egos, right? Like how self-deprecation becomes this negative feedback loop that ultimately leads to more likely negative behaviors in your adulthood, right? Could you maybe speak to some of that if what I'm saying is making sense and you see it in some of the people you work with or your own experience?
Yeah, because when we see these examples of how we're supposed to look or what we're supposed to be like, it puts us in this mind state of, oh, that must be success, that must be perfection, that must be all these things, like all these concepts that I'm not. And then what happens is this chase. And I got stuck in it most of my childhood where I just kept chasing what I thought I was supposed to be that was different, what I thought I was supposed to be that was successful, what I thought was supposed to be liked. And what that happens is it contributes to a ton of different mental health disorders. And then those are just reinforced every time you get exposure to that loop. And then you're stuck in it. And you don't even know you're stuck in it. And that's what most of your life is like, unless until you meet somebody that can stop it or shake you a little bit and be like, hey, now, wait a second, what's going on here? Thankfully, mental health is getting more and more accepted and more known and more popular. So I'm able to be working with some adolescents and some teens who are just getting into that loop and just starting to develop these beliefs that they need to pursue XYZ to change who they are so they can fit that mold. And I'm working with folks that are in their 80s that have been stuck in that loop for their entire life. But I'm also working with 14, 15-year-olds who are just entering it. So what's nice, thank you, human brain, is that we can stop it. We can challenge it. It just takes a lot of persistence. It takes support. It takes awareness, which a lot of folks don't have for a lot of their life. But what's nice is it is possible. And to me, that's hopeful, which is why I'm really grateful that the brain, if we can get in there and people give me permission to work with them and other therapists that are aware of this, it can actually improve. So that's what's promising to me. And maybe we can get into those Hollywood folks. Like, hey, let's start to change the script a little bit, maybe.
I do love that there have been some Hollywood interviews where people have asked about, especially women, right? Like they try to talk about their body or something and they're like, That's what you wanna talk to me about in this moment?" And those clips going viral on TikTok are changing the narrative for kids. It's not enough to combat the plethora of misinformation and diet culture
Yeah.
also on TikTok about all the other things, like, that's been one of the problems with my teenager, right, is this exposure based on the algorithm and things they're not even, like, actively seeking out themselves, but is being like continually reinforced to them. But I think
Ugh.
moments and glimmers like that give hope, right? Like they also learned from TikTok that if you're going to the doctor's office and they want to weigh you, that you can just say no thanks. Like,
Oh
which I
man,
didn't
I would have
know.
loved
My
to not
entire
know
life.
that.
I remember it's like I used to call my mom. I talked about this in the book. I used to call my mom every time I was fat shamed for that. They would put me on the scale for whatever reason I was going in for, fibroids, pain, like you name it.
ear infection. Let's weigh
Yeah,
you.
yeah, maybe it's
But the fat
that's what's
shaming would be extreme. It would be subtle. It would be, but I would sit there feeling awful about myself. And then I would call my mom and just rattle off all the things they said in tears. And she'd be like, honey, that's weight discrimination. That's not okay. Call them. And I'm like, with what energy? With like, I feel dead right now. Like I would
What
just
an
rip to
amazing
pieces.
mom, though, that she like
Oh,
knew
yeah.
enough to say that.
every time, every single time. Yeah.
But you have also become someone who, and I mean, for a long time now, I think, who does stand up to people on that kind of thing, which is amazing.
Yeah.
You
Even through
know,
my pregnancy, they used to say like, oh, you're a little happy for your pregnancy. I'm like, just shut up. Like I know what I am. I am healthy. This baby is growing. I'm killing it. You go like, no, like get out of here.
yeah.
I fired somebody during my prenatal health.
Good.
Like, it's just like, get off my care team. You're not even caring for me.
Well, and I think a lot of people don't realize that they can fire someone, right? That like these people work for us. We're paying them. They're our service providers, and we don't have to take weight discrimination and these kinds of things for them. I remember with my first pregnancy, I had lost weight and I hadn't had a period in a long time. And losing weight is what got me pregnant to begin with because I didn't really think that was possible. And also, I was in my early 20s. I'm not super smart about that stuff. And I went into the doctor's office pregnant, and I remember the doctor said to me, "You shouldn't have gotten pregnant." And it was just like, it stuck with me now as like a woman in my 40s and more experience is like, literally, that is the worst thing that he could have said to me. And it was such a red flag. I should have walked away and been like, what do you want me to do about it now, buddy? Right. But instead, I spent the whole time being fat shamed and weight discriminated against my pregnancy and was talked into all kinds of interventions that I didn't need and all these kinds of things. And there are so many people who that is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of like medical discrimination with weight. People who have tumors who never get diagnosed as cancer because they're being told, oh, you should just lose weight, right? Like so many things like that.
It's
And it's, go ahead, Ian.
I was just gonna just agreeing. It's one of the most odious kind of things that happen to fat people that's out there. Because then we don't like my experience. I think Alisa, you went to the doctor more often. My experience was moving away from home and just never wanting to talk about it because it was so laden with pain for me. So I didn't call mom when like a doctor fat shamed me. I just didn't go to the doctor anymore. For more than a decade, I didn't go to the doctor. If I had something that was wrong with me, I would go to urgent care and I have gout. And when I would have a gout flare up, I would go to urgent care and they would say it's a sprained ankle. And then they would give me at first opiates. And then like all of a sudden they were like, don't do that anymore. And then just 800 milligram ibuprofen, which was for somebody with high blood pressure. That was also a bad thing to be taking. And I just never went. I stuck my head in the sand. And I think that happens to a lot of people because you could walk in with a samurai sword sticking out of your torso and they're going to be like, hey, you need to lose some weight. Like that's the first
And I
thing
will
they'll tell.
say that providers are, I'm noted, at least through my experience, because I was working in primary care clinics and I was hearing a lot of doctors get really stuck on weight. It was just a weight-centric care model over and over and over. And it didn't matter what the chief complaint was. And then I would educate them because I was on the back end. I was able to talk to the providers respectfully, competently, which unfortunately is required sometimes. But I talked to them and said, that's not the way you treat these patients. Like they're more than their weight. Their weight is not a helpful number. I'd give them the BMI spiel. They'd be like, oh, I didn't know. Like these were brilliant humans and they were lacking this knowledge. And then I would see them try to change. I would see them try to embrace this information. And so my brother was also very helpful about this. Like there are good doctors out there that have really important training and skills that we don't have. And then they're lacking the awareness of how to work with somebody who's fat. And then some providers are open to learning and shifting their model of care to be inclusive and not weight centric, and others don't. Others have an issue with it. And those are the ones that need to be fired. The ones over here, though, the ones that are wanting to listen and embrace and learn how to treat people, all people equally and lovingly and not weight centric, I want to teach them. And I've had a lot of providers that failed with me at first. I educated them on the impact and then they adjusted. And then we were able to recover. And I think those providers should be known about too, because they can't all know everything. And I'm just another population that they need to improve with. And I'm happy to be the educator, but it also isn't my responsibility to be the educator. So it's this like dance that I get stuck in sometimes. And
No, totally. Yeah. I appreciate that point, and I agree that there are absolutely people who are wanting to learn and who are changing. I've had lots of those doctors on the show and am so grateful for the work that they're doing to share that message with their community. And at the same time, it is not a fat person's responsibility to educate someone on the harm that they're being caused. Because as you said, after you would leave from being weight discriminated at the doctor, you did not have the energy to do anything, right? Like we do not have, as we are literally being discriminated against, the energy in that moment to then say, hey, let me educate you about how you're harming
yeah,
me. And by the way, weight bias is more harmful to human
yeah,
health than the physical weight on my body because
Yeah.
you're shaming me and preventing me from going to the doctor for another decade, like Ian did,
hmm
right? So it all compounds into all of these
yeah.
problems.
There's
Yeah.
also this fear. I think this like inherent insecurity we have, and I'm speaking to a doctor partially here, right? But like, it's where you're like, I'm going to tell a doctor. Like that was the thing that like still to this day have had trouble. Luckily, I found like my cardiologist is great. My primary care is great too. But like the idea where I'm like, I'm going to correct a doctor. I'm just going to catch them on that thing. But it's like, yeah, you can. If you're being dehumanized, you can check them on humanity. Like you said, it's not our responsibility at all. But that was a deep insecurity for me where I'm like, I'm some yutz. I can't tell a doctor what to do. But you can identify if you're feeling that the doctor's not the right fit for you.
I feel like I
I
have a scorecard every time I like of like both the doctor and myself when I like schedule the appointment. I'm like, okay, anxiety, I've scheduled it. It's in my life. Now I have that anticipation. Then I get there and like they're gonna say my name wrong. They're gonna say my name wrong. They're gonna want to weigh me. They're gonna look at me fun. They're gonna see I'm fat. They're gonna like so I start having all these thoughts and they're like, Alisa Karmel, come on back. I'm like, do I correct them? Do I correct them? Do I correct like and this is today. I feel like a confident, knowledgeable person. And I still am like, my heart's racing. I have anxiety. Like, it's just like, and then they're like, can I get your blood pressure? I'm and it's like, they haven't even done the thing yet that I'm there for. And I'm
I
already
waved
like,
off I waved off a blood pressure reading the other day. I felt like a magician. I was like sitting in there. I went in for a like an eye infection or what, like a sty. It ended up being not that that matters to anyone listening, but yeah, they were like, and we're gonna take your blood pressure. I was like, I'd rather not, and they were like, okay, and it felt
right.
crazy. It felt amazing, like that they were like they just accepted that and moved on. I was like, oh, I didn't know you could do that.
So I have a lot to say on this matter. So, I've also noticed the varying responses from MAs when they do want to wait. And I say no. It's just wild. I mean, they're, oh, okay. Like, it's almost like I've startled them off of their one position. Like, they don't know what to
Yes.
do now. Yeah.
And there have been a couple of times where they've been like, well, no, I need to rate. I'm like, what for? I'm like,
Yeah.
and then I'm like, well, the doctor might need it for medication. I'm like, okay, I'll talk with the doctor about that if that's needed. Right. And for my child that is working on their relationship with food, they do need to be weighed because we need to make sure that they are eating enough and these kinds of things.
Yeah.
It's the opposite problem, right? Of like, hey, we need to make sure that you're not muscle wasting and different kinds of things. And
Mhm.
so we're very careful about how we approach that, right? And so if medical providers do need a weight, I think that we need to go back to the way that people are learned in school to understand how many people are affected by disordered eating, especially young people. And that if we're going to do things like you need to be weighed, there are a lot of different ways that those words can be shared. People encourage someone, would you like to turn around? Right? Like different kinds of things that I think inherently don't come from, especially if you're a doctor who is taking mainstream insurance and you're having to shuffle people
Yeah.
in and out so quickly because
Yeah.
you're making pennies to the dollar of what you need to be making in order to run your office. You don't have that kind of compassionate care, the time to learn, to read new studies about how the BMI is complete bunk and weight bias is problematic and like all these things that we're talking about because you're just like, constantly shuffling people in and out of your office too quickly.
Yeah, for sure.
I've
I don't
started when I have patients who are going to go for a PCP appointment and they know wait's going to happen. It might be necessary because they're on medication. I have them actually weigh themselves in my appointment with them, which is virtual. And we just process like what's come up for you. What are your emotions? What are your reactions and why? And I think that if there was like a bit more conversation about weight that didn't have to do with like what this number means, but like what this number means and how it's affecting you, I think that it would actually reduce the power that weight has on people too,
Mhm.
because it is such like I don't want to see it. It's like, but it's another metric. And let's talk about what this metric even is, like really is, because ultimately it's probably not that important for, unless depending if it is, but in most cases it isn't. So
Yeah, absolutely. I try to explain to people too that talk with me about like an experience that they've had that's been hard or something like that on them, or their doctor told them they were such and such in a BMI chart. And I'm like, well, Dwayne Johnson's higher than you. And it was like, I think part of it is also like this perception and the shame and the whatever that we had that you just have to throw the curveball and be like, did you see it go by? Did you see how that wasn't exactly what you thought it was? It can be really
Every
powerful.
every
Yep,
professional
exactly.
athlete, like LeBron James is medically obese. You know what I mean? Based on BMI. It's wild. It's insane.
Completely useless measure. Absolutely. All right. Well, I always like to leave listeners with something positive and actionable that they can take to be of service to work on themselves. And I would like to start with you, Ian, because I do think that you have a lot of funniness, right? Like comedy that can be brought to, but also like, hey, maybe we need to be aware of self-deprecation. Or I'm not sure like what your kind of take would be on if someone was listening to the show today and they wanted to walk away and feel like, A, I learned something, B, I don't feel overwhelmed, and C, I'm gonna do this thing and it's gonna help me feel like a better person. What would you suggest that be?
So I get one thing that I think is that I wish I could go back in time and tell like a younger version of myself is, and maybe this is not going to sound positive at first, but to me it would have been, which is that they're not thinking about you at all. Where when I was younger, and not just younger, when I was still to this day, in fact, it's the thing I struggle with, where you assume people are making fun of you. You assume people are like laughing about you. And I know that was a big part of, I think, my instinct to self deprecate in such a often unhealthy way, especially earlier on. And then once I became a stand up comedian, was to beat people to the joke, to make it before they could, to beat them to the punch, and sometimes sacrifice myself on the altar of fat shaming just because at least it was me doing the sacrificing instead of a bunch of people who I assumed were going to do it because it had happened a few times and it will happen. It's going to happen. Kids can be terrible and they will make fun of whatever vulnerability you have.
Not
But
just kids.
oh,
I get
you're
it from
so
adults.
right. Yeah, adults, yeah. The
Kids on the
80-year-olds
internet
would.
can be pretty bad.
Oh my lord. Oh yeah, worse than kids actually. I would give me a third grade bully over an anonymous person on Twitter with a Roman statue, Avi, 8 days a week. But oftentimes they are thinking about what they're going to have for lunch that day, or something their aunt said to them the night before, or a movie they're going to go see that weekend. They are, as much as you think that this is like an ongoing conversation about them, they're not often not thinking about you at all. They have their own stuff going on. So you don't need to be so eager to beat them to the punch. You don't need to be so eager to be cruel to yourself to try to gain acceptance from these people, to make jokes about yourself that are going to make you feel worse later on. Be funny. Make jokes about yourself. There's plenty of things you can make fun of. And if sometimes a fat joke slips out here and there, that's okay too. Forgive yourself for that. But I think let yourself off the hook, and to a certain extent let other people off the hook too, because they're not people often aren't as cruel as maybe you are paranoid that they are.
Mm.
And I think you can harm yourself by making that assumption. It's the opposite of termites. It's like once you see two or three termites, they're already in the foundation. And I don't think it's like that with humanity. I think it's once you see two or three bullies, that was two or three bullies. And the rest of the people on earth tend to be pretty nice if you get to know them. So I guess that would be the thing I would leave them with.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that the analogy of termites is a really good one because it is very often that the loudest people are the minority, for sure.
Yeah.
So even if you're hearing something, it's not how most people perceive or believe or so, yeah. How about you,
Yeah.
Eliza?
Yeah, and those bullies probably are hurting because usually hurt people. So I'm always curious what's going on for them. Take your space, like own your space. I feel like I've always, as girl, and still living in a fat body, I'm always trying to, like, oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, like I'm taking it. No, like own it. Like me physically reclaiming all space in my room currently. Like just own your space and do it unapologetically because I have this tendency to constantly apologize for this. I'm inconveniencing people because of whatever. And it's like, no, like own it. Don't apologize about it. Own it. Don't own it. And that's hard, but practice it. Yeah. Short and
It
sweet.
reminds me of the quote Elise Myers shares, who is in a street-sized body, but she shares the quote, "Go find less," right? If I'm too much for you, then go find less.
Oh, I love that.
And and I think that's something that we can all hold on to regardless of our body size or anything. Like,
Yeah.
if I'm too much, go find less. Because I really think that has like puts it on them instead of it being about you being too much,
Mm.
right? So yeah, I love both of those. So thank you both so much for being here and being on the show. Can you remind listeners where to find you, where to find your book, all the things?
Yeah, the book is called T-Shirt Swim Club. You can pre-order it now. It's available everywhere. I'm not certain when this comes out. It's available everywhere June 11th. Contractually, we have to say everywhere you can buy books. Amazon.com, Barnes& and Noble. Bookshop.org, which is a wonderful website that lets you purchase a book online through a local bookstore. Local bookstores existing on the thinnest of margins. So that's a wonderful thing you can do. Powells.com. Shout out to Portland, where we're from.
Yeah.
You can find me at iancarmel.com or at Ian Carmel with a K across all socials. And my brilliant sister.
And you can find me at dralisacarmel.com or at Dr. Alisa Karmel. Only on Instagram, though. I'm not a super social human otherwise, but go find Ian. He's fun to follow.
And I want to thank you, just for not just for having us, but also for like challenging me. I have found that this entire process from writing the book and having Alisa check me constantly to having people read the book and say, like respond to certain things I wrote, all the way from like Roxanne Gay, who was lovely enough to read the book and give us a quote for it, to just like friends who've read it, to now to wonderful, brilliant people like you. I really appreciate it as a continuing educational experience and an ongoing conversation. So I really wanted to say I appreciate that, in addition to you having us on.
Well, and I appreciate willingness to have the conversation. I think that hopefully it helps other people to process and figure out how to have conversations with people in their lives, not just the kind that we're having, but also like when you're at the Thanksgiving dinner and your mother-in-law raises an eyebrow and says, "You really need a second portion?" Like, I hear from people so many times about how to process those kinds of
Yeah.
experiences. And I think being able to have a conversation in a mature sort of way and to process like where we're each coming from and the lived experience that we might all have, the triggers that we might have, like those kinds of things are what allow us to move forward as a society to understand how to express ourselves in ways that don't hurt others, which I'd
Yeah.
like to think most of us want to do. Right. So
I also think people should be imprisoned for bringing up portions on Thanksgiving of all days. It's unforgivable any day, but on Thanksgiving, you should go directly to jail.
if you're the person wearing a belt intentionally instead of the person wearing leggings intentionally, like we're not coming from the same place, right?
You did that to yourself. Don't play. It's not. Don't take your belt out on me. That's ridiculous.
All right. Well, Ian, it's been a pleasure to laugh with you. Alisa, thank you so much for all the insights and everything you've provided as well. Listeners, we'll put links in the show notes for where you can find them both and everything else. I want to thank you so much for being here and listening. If you've enjoyed the show, I would so appreciate if you could leave a review saying so. It costs you nothing, but just 30 seconds of your time and makes a huge difference in my being able to continue to do this work. And don't forget to follow or subscribe in whatever app you're using. And as always, your willingness to be open to grow through your own personal change is so appreciated. No one is perfect, but in listening, learning, and unlearning, we can choose to become better versions of ourselves for ourselves. Thank you both so much for being here. And listeners, I'll be back again next week.